The blood soaking through Katherine Voss's shirt was spreading faster than she could press the fabric down. But she kept her jaw locked tight as she stumbled past the saloon, past the mercantile, past every building in Red Cloud, Nebraska that might have offered help. July 1878 had brought drought and desperation to this corner of the prairie, and Katherine had learned years ago that the only person she could count on was herself, even when a bullet from a botched robbery attempt was draining the life from her side. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught between two men arguing over a card game that turned into flying lead. One stray bullet, and now she was paying the price for someone else's stupidity. Katherine made it to the edge of town before her legs started to give out. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street, and sweat mixed with blood as she leaned against a weathered fence post. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she pushed forward. Her small homestead was another mile out, and if she could just make it there, she could handle this herself. She always handled things herself. The sound of horse hooves made her straighten up despite the agony lancing through her torso. She would not show weakness, not to anyone. "Madam, you are bleeding." The voice was deep, concerned, and belonged to a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. Keith Dawson was his name, she remembered, though she had made it her business to avoid remembering much about anyone. He was a ranch hand for one of the bigger spreads outside town, and right now he was dismounting from a dusty bay horse with movements that suggested he was about to interfere in something that was none of his concern. "I am fine," Katherine said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to stand without leaning on the fence. "Go about your business." Keith's hat shaded his face, but she could see his jaw was set with determination. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way men got from hard work, not from boasting, and his dark eyes were fixed on the bloodstain spreading across her pale blue shirt. "Madam, you have been shot. You need a doctor." "I said I am fine." Katherine pushed away from the fence and took 3 steps before the world tilted sideways. Her knees buckled, and she braced for the impact of hard, packed earth. Instead, strong arms caught her, and she found herself held against a solid chest that smelled of leather, horse, and sun-warmed cotton. "Let me go," she said, but her voice had lost its strength along with her blood. "Not a chance," Keith said quietly. He adjusted his grip, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. "Doc Henderson is back in town. We are going there now." "No." Katherine tried to push against his chest, but her arms felt like they were made of water. "Put me down. I do not need anyone. I can handle this myself." "I can see that," Keith said, and there was no mockery in his voice, just a steady certainty that made something in her chest tighten. "But you do not have to." She wanted to argue more, wanted to demand he release her, but darkness was creeping in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, and the gentle way he told her she was going to be all right. When Katherine woke, she was lying on a narrow cot in Doc Henderson's office. The older man was cleaning his instruments at a basin, and late afternoon light streamed through the window. Her side throbbed with a deep, angry pain, but when she moved her hand to touch it, she found bandages wrapped firmly around her torso. "The bullet went clean through," Doc Henderson said without turning around. "You are lucky. Another inch to the right and we would be having a very different conversation, or rather, we would not be having one at all." Katherine tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The doctor turned and fixed her with a stern look. "You will stay put for at least 2 days. That wound needs to start healing before you go traipsing around like nothing happened." "I cannot afford 2 days," Katherine said. "I have animals to feed, a garden to tend. I cannot just lie here." "Already taken care of," said a voice from the doorway. Keith Dawson stood there, hat in hand, looking somehow larger in the enclosed space. He had cleaned up since bringing her in, she noticed. His face was freshly washed, his hair dampened and combed back. "What do you mean, taken care of?" Katherine demanded, that old familiar panic rising in her chest. She did not like owing anyone anything. Debts meant obligations, and obligations meant people had power over you. Keith stepped into the room, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. "I rode out to your place. Fed your chickens, watered your horse and that milk cow. Your garden looks like it could use some attention, but it will hold another day or two. You had no right." The words came out sharper than Katherine intended, but she could not help it. The thought of this stranger on her property, in her space, made her skin crawl with anxiety. "I did not ask you to do that." "No," Keith agreed, pulling a chair closer to the cot and sitting down with the easy patience of a man who spent long hours in the saddle. "You did not ask. You would not ask for help if you were dying, which, by the way, you pretty near were. Then you should have let me handle it my own way." Katherine tried to inject steel into her voice, but it came out tired instead. Doc Henderson snorted from his position by the basin. "Your own way would have been bleeding out in a ditch somewhere between here and your homestead, Miss Voss. This young man saved your life. I did not ask him to save it. Some things do not require asking," Keith said quietly. His dark eyes held hers, and Katherine found she could not look away. There was something steady in his gaze, something that made her think of deep water and ancient stones. Sometimes helping is just the right thing to do. Katherine wanted to argue, wanted to push him away with words the way she pushed everyone away, but exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. Her eyelids felt heavy, and the pain medication Doc Henderson had given her was making her thoughts fuzzy around the edges. "I will pay you back," she managed to say, "for your time, whatever it costs." "There is no cost," Keith said, and he said it like he meant it. "Get some rest, Miss Voss. Your homestead will be there when you are ready to return to it." She wanted to protest more, but sleep dragged her down before she could form the words. Over the next 2 days, Katherine discovered that Keith Dawson was a man of his word and also insufferably persistent. Despite her objections, he showed up every morning and evening, reporting on the state of her animals and property. He brought her meals from the boarding house, ignored her sharp comments about not needing a nursemaid, and somehow managed to never make her feel like she was weak for being bedridden. "Your chickens are laying well," he said on the second evening, sitting in that same chair beside her cot. "Got near a dozen eggs yesterday. I traded some to Mrs. Chen at the mercantile for grain to feed them with, so you are not out any money." Katherine frowned. "You should not have done that." "Would you rather I let them go hungry?" "I would rather you leave my affairs alone." Keith leaned back in the chair, studying her with those calm, dark eyes. "Why do you fight so hard against someone trying to help you?" "Because help comes with strings," Katherine said flatly. "Always." Something shifted in Keith's expression, a flicker of understanding. "Who hurt you, Miss Voss?" The question was so gentle, so unexpected that Katherine felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away furiously. "That is none of your concern." "Maybe not," Keith agreed. "But I am not them, whoever they were. I do not want anything from you except maybe the chance to see you get better." "Why?" The word burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why do you care? You do not even know me." Keith was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sounds of red cloud drifted through the window horses' voices, the creak of wagon wheels. Finally, he said, "My mother died when I was 12. She got sick, and my father was too proud to ask the neighbors for help. Too proud to admit we could not handle it on our own. By the time he finally broke down and asked, it was too late." He turned his hat in his hands, not looking at Katherine now. "I swore after that, if I ever saw someone too stubborn to ask for help, I would give it anyway, because maybe I cannot save everyone, but I can try." Katherine felt something crack in the armor she had built around her heart. "I am sorry about your mother. I am sorry about whoever made you think you had to do everything alone," Keith replied, and his eyes met hers again. "But you do not anymore, not if you do not want to." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But when Keith stood to leave, she did not tell him not to come back. Doc Henderson released her on the third day with strict instructions to take it easy and change her bandages daily. Katherine was determined to get back to her homestead and her normal life, to put this whole incident behind her. She could handle her own affairs. She always had. Except when she arrived at her small property on the borrowed horse Doc Henderson had arranged for her, she found Keith Dawson in her garden, pulling weeds under the fierce Nebraska sun. "What are you doing here?" Katherine asked, dismounting carefully to avoid pulling her stitches. Keith looked up, squinting against the light. His shirt was damp with sweat and there was dirt on his hands. "Your garden was getting overrun. Figured I would help out." "I told you. You told me you do not need help. I heard you." Keith straightened, pulling off his work gloves. "But I was riding by anyway, and it seemed a shame to let all these vegetables go to waste. You have tomatoes that need picking, and those beans are about ready too." Katherine opened her mouth to tell him to leave, to say she could handle her own garden, but the words stuck in her throat. The truth was, her side ached fiercely from the short ride, and the thought of bending over to pull weeds made her want to lie down. "Fine," she said instead. "But I am paying you for the work. No need. I insist." Keith considered her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. You can pay me by letting me come back tomorrow to finish this section here." He gestured to the far end of the garden. "And maybe you could make some of that lemonade I see you have lemons for. It is powerful hot out here." It was a trap, Katherine realized. A gentle one, but a trap nonetheless. If she agreed, she would be admitting she needed his help. If she refused, she would be churlish and ungrateful. She looked at the garden, at the neat rows where Keith had already pulled weeds, at the tomatoes he had picked and left in a basket by the fence. "One glass of lemonade," she said finally. "And then you go." Keith's face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had seen from him, and Katherine felt her breath catch. He was handsome when he smiled, she realized. Handsome in a way that had nothing to do with fine features and everything to do with genuine warmth. "Deal," he said. She made the lemonade while Keith finished the section he was working on, moving carefully around her small house and trying to ignore how much her side hurt. The place was sparse, just one room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stove. She had built it herself 3 years ago when she fled west after her father died, leaving behind a life in Ohio that had nearly destroyed her. Everything she owned, she had earned with her own hands. She did not need anyone, and she did not want anyone. That was how she survived. But when she brought the lemonade outside and found Keith washing up at the pump, his shirt clinging to his back and his face turned up to catch the water, she felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the way he looked in the golden afternoon light. "Here," she said, thrusting the glass toward him perhaps more forcefully than necessary. Keith took it with a nod of thanks and drank deeply. "That is the best lemonade I've had in years," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "It is just lemons, water, and sugar." "Maybe. But it tastes better when someone makes it for you." He finished the glass and handed it back. "I should head out. The ranch will be expecting me." "Thank you," Katherine said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. "For the garden and for everything else." Keith picked up his hat from where he had left it on the fence post. "I will come by tomorrow if that is all right, just to finish up." Katherine should have said no, should have told him she could handle it from here, but instead she found herself nodding. All right, tomorrow. She watched him ride away, dust rising behind his horse, and wondered what she was doing. Keith came back the next day and the day after that. At first, it was just to finish the garden, but then he noticed her fence needed mending, and after that, he saw that her barn door was hanging crooked. Each time, Katherine told herself she would refuse his help, and each time she found reasons to let him stay. He never asked for anything in return except water or lemonade, and sometimes they would sit on her porch as the sun set and talk about inconsequential things, the weather, the town gossip, the way the prairie grass looked when the wind moved through it. "You do not talk much about yourself," Keith observed one evening about 2 weeks after the shooting. They were sitting on the porch steps, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. "There is not much to tell," Katherine said, which was a lie. There was plenty to tell, but none of it was anything she wanted to share. "Everyone has a story," Keith said. He was whittling a piece of wood, shaving off long curls that drifted to the ground. "Where did you come from before Nebraska?" "Ohio." The word came out clipped, final. "Family, dead." Keith nodded slowly, not pushing for more. That was something she appreciated about him. He knew when to let silence stand. "My father is still alive," he said after a while. "Runs a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. We do not talk much anymore. Too many hard words between us after my mother died." "I am sorry," Katherine said, and she meant it. "Me too." Keith examined the piece of wood in his hands. It was starting to take shape. A bird, she realized. A hawk with wings spread wide. But sometimes people cannot get past their own pain long enough to see other people hurting too. I think that is what happened with us. We both hurt so much we could not help each other heal. Katherine thought about her own father, about the way grief had turned him cruel after her mother's death. About the years she spent trying to be enough, to fill the hole her mother left, only to fail again and again. About the man her father had tried to force her to marry, a friend of his who was twice her age and had a reputation for meanness. She had run the night before the wedding, taking only what she could carry, and a horse she fully intended to pay back someday. "Sometimes running is the only way to heal," she said quietly. Keith looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. "Is that what you are doing out here? Healing?" "I am surviving," Katherine said. "It is different." "Maybe," Keith said, "or maybe it is time to do more than just survive." The word stayed with Katherine long after Keith rode away that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the prairie wind and the distant howl of coyotes, and wondered when surviving had stopped being enough. August brought brutal heat to Red Cloud. The drought continued, and tempers in town ran short as water became scarce and crops withered in the fields. Katherine's well was still producing, barely, and she rationed her water carefully. Keith had taken to coming by every few days, ostensibly to check on things, but really, Katherine suspected, to check on her. She had stopped telling him to leave. It was frightening how quickly she had gotten used to his presence, how she found herself listening for the sound of his horse in the late afternoon, how she started making extra food on the days she expected him. They had fallen into an easy rhythm. He would help with whatever heavy work needed doing. She would feed him dinner, and they would sit on the porch and talk until the stars came out. "Tell me something real," Keith said one night. They had finished a meal of fried chicken and greens from her garden, and the dishes were washed and put away. "Something you have never told anyone else." Katherine's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject. But there was something about the darkness, about the way Keith sat with his shoulder almost touching hers, that made her brave. "I am afraid," she said quietly. "All the time. I am afraid that if I let myself need anyone, they will leave or die or hurt me, and I will not survive it." Keith did not say anything for a long moment. Then, "I am afraid too." "Of what?" "That I will never be enough. That I will try to help someone and fail, like I failed my mother. That I will care about someone and lose them, and it will break something in me that cannot be fixed." He turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "But I think being afraid and being alone are not the same thing, and I think being alone might be worse." Catherine's heart was beating too fast in her chest. "Keith, I like coming here," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I like talking to you. I like the way you refuse to give up, even when everything is hard. I like that you are stubborn and strong and you make the best lemonade I have ever tasted." He paused. "I like you, Katherine, more than I probably should." She should have told him to stop. Should have protected both of them from the inevitable pain that came from caring. But instead she reached out in the darkness and found his hand. "I like you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." Keith's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "Then we can be terrified together." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, not talking, just being. And for the first time in 3 years, Katherine felt like maybe surviving was not all she was capable of. Things shifted after that night. Keith still came by to help with the work, but now there was an understanding between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither of them quite knew what to do with. They moved around each other carefully, like people learning a new dance. "Come into town with me on Saturday," Keith said one afternoon in mid-August. He was repairing a weak spot in her barn roof while Katherine fed the chickens below. "There is a dance at the church. Nothing fancy, just fiddle music and people being sociable." Katherine's stomach clenched at the thought. She avoided social gatherings, avoided situations where people might ask questions or try to get close. "I do not dance. Neither do I, really." Keith climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I thought maybe we could not dance together." Despite herself, Katherine smiled. "That is the worst invitation I have ever heard." Is that a yes? She should say no, should keep the walls up, keep herself safe. But Keith was looking at her with those steady dark eyes, and she found herself nodding. "Yes, but if anyone asks, we are just friends." "Whatever you want," Keith said, and the gentle understanding in his voice made her want to cry. The dance was more crowded than Katherine expected. It seemed like half the county had turned out for the event, desperate for any distraction from the heat and drought. The church hall was decorated with wildflowers and paper streamers, and a 3-piece band was playing a lively reel. Keith had cleaned up for the occasion, wearing a shirt she suspected he had borrowed because it was too fine for ranch work. And Katherine had put on her one good dress, a simple green cotton that had belonged to her mother. "You look beautiful," Keith said when he picked her up, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "It is just a dress." "It is not the dress," Keith said, offering her his arm. "It is you." They did dance, despite both their claims of inability. Keith was clumsy but earnest, and Katherine found herself laughing as they stumbled through a waltz. It had been so long since she laughed like that, free and unself-conscious, that the sound surprised her. "You should laugh more often," Keith said, spinning her inexpertly. "It suits you." "Maybe I will," Katherine said, "if you keep dancing like you have 2 left feet." "Hey now," Keith protested, but he was grinning. "I am doing my best here." They took a break after a few dances, standing outside in the marginally cooler evening air. Other couples milled around, and Katherine noticed the looks they were getting. Curious looks, speculative looks. It made her uncomfortable, being the subject of attention. "Katherine Voss," said a voice behind them. "I did not expect to see you here." Katherine turned to find Margaret Shaw, the banker's wife, regarding her with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Margaret was the kind of woman who knew everyone's business and made it her mission to share it. "Mrs. Shaw," Katherine said neutrally, "and Keith Dawson." Margaret's smile widened. My, are you two courting?" "We are friends," Katherine said quickly before Keith could answer. Of course, of course." Margaret's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "It is just unusual to see you at social events, dear. You keep to yourself so much." Some people were beginning to wonder about you. "Wonder what?" Keith's voice had gone cool. Margaret waved a hand. "Oh, nothing bad. Just curious about a young woman living all alone out on a homestead. It is quite unusual, you know. Most women your age are married or living with family." "Miss Voss is managing her property just fine," Keith said, and there was an edge to his voice that Katherine had never heard before. "She does not need to answer to anyone about her choices." "Of course not," Margaret said, though her expression had gone pinched. "I was merely making conversation." She drifted away, already turning to whisper to another woman nearby. Katherine felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. This was why she avoided town, avoided people. They always wanted explanations, always needed to categorize and understand. "We should go," she said to Keith. "Because of her, Katherine, do not let Margaret Shaw drive you away. She gossips about everyone." "It is not just her." Katherine could feel eyes on them now, could imagine the whispers. "The strange woman who lives alone, the woman who does not need anyone. I should not have come. Hey." Keith caught her hand gently. "Look at me." When she did, his expression was fierce. "You have every right to be here. You have every right to live however you want, with or without people's approval, and anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me. You cannot fight the whole town for me." "Watch me," Keith said, and he said it like a promise. Something warm unfurled in Katherine's chest. No one had ever defended her like that, had ever stood between her and judgment without asking for anything in return. "Thank you," she said softly. "Always," Keith replied, and she believed him. They stayed for another hour, and Katherine found that Margaret Shaw's whispers bothered her less when Keith was beside her, solid and certain. When he took her home that night, riding slowly under a sky full of stars, she felt something shifting inside her, some locked door beginning to crack open. "I had a good time tonight," she told him as they reached her homestead. "Even with the gossips, even with them." Katherine dismounted, wincing slightly as her mostly healed wound pulled. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" It was a small offer, but they both knew it meant something larger. Keith had never been inside her house, had always respected the boundary she set. "I would like that," he said quietly. Katherine lit the lamp while Keith tended to the horses, and by the time he came inside, she had coffee brewing on the stove. The small space felt even smaller with him in it, but not in a bad way. More like he fit there, like the room had been waiting for him. "You have built a good life here," Keith said, looking around at the simple but tidy interior. "You should be proud." "I am," Katherine said, surprised to realize it was true. "It is not much, but it is mine." "That matters," Keith said. "Having something that is yours that no one can take from you, that matters a lot." They drank their coffee at the small table, knees almost touching in the confined space. Katherine told him about Ohio, about her father's descent into bitterness, about the man she had fled from. Keith listened without judgment, his face serious in the lamplight. "He tried to come after me once," Katherine said, staring into her coffee cup. "About 6 months after I got here. Showed up in town asking about a woman matching my description. Someone told him they had seen me, but before he could find my homestead, his horse threw him. Broke his leg in 3 places. By the time he healed up, I guess he decided I was not worth the trouble." She looked up at Keith. "I was so relieved, but also so angry. Angry that I had to run, that I had to build a whole new life because men like him think they own women like me." You are not owned by anyone, Keith said firmly. You never were, and you never will be. I know that now, Katherine said. But for a long time I was so afraid, and I guess I am still afraid in different ways. Keith reached across the table and took her hand. Fear is not weakness, Katherine. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is being afraid and doing the thing anyway. And you are the most courageous person I know. I am not, Katherine started to protest, but Keith shook his head. You are. You left everything you knew to build a new life. You survived getting shot and refused to let it break you. You let me help you even though everything in you wanted to push me away. That is courage. Katherine felt tears sting her eyes. Keith, she stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. I care about you so much, and it scares me because I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to let someone in. Then we will figure it out together, Keith said simply. There is no rush, Katherine. We can take this as slow as you need. What if I need to take it very slow? Then we will go very slow. What if I have days where I push you away? Then I will give you space and come back when you are ready. What if I cannot be what you need? Keith stood and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair. He took both her hands in his, looking up at her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. Katherine, you are already what I need. You are strong and honest and real. You do not play games or pretend to be something you are not. That is all I want. That is all I have ever wanted. I am broken, Katherine whispered, in ways that might not ever fully heal. We are all broken, Keith said. Every single one of us. But maybe broken pieces can fit together and make something new, something stronger than either piece was alone. Katherine leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. I want to try, she said. I am terrified, but I want to try. That is all we need, Keith said. Just the willingness to try. He kissed her then, soft and careful, and Katherine felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the fear and hope and desperate longing she had kept locked away for so long. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Stay, she said impulsively. Not I mean you can sleep in the chair or I can make a pallet on the floor. I just do not want you to leave yet, Keith smiled. I will take the floor, and Katherine. Thank you for trusting me. They made him a makeshift bed with spare blankets, and Katherine lay in her own bed listening to his breathing in the darkness. She had spent so many nights alone, convinced that solitude was safety. But now, with Keith a few feet away, she realized that maybe connection was its own kind of safety. Maybe letting someone in was not weakness but the bravest thing she could do. September brought cooler weather and finally, blessedly, rain. The drought broke with a series of storms that turned the prairie green almost overnight. Katherine's garden revived, and the tension that had gripped Red Cloud all summer eased. Keith continued to visit regularly, and slowly, carefully, Katherine let him become part of her life. They rode out to his father's ranch one Sunday afternoon. Katherine had been nervous about meeting Keith's father, worried about judgment or disapproval. But Kenneth Dawson turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with his son's dark eyes, and a sadness that seemed to live in the lines of his face. So you are the woman my son has been talking about, Kenneth said, shaking Katherine's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. I hope he has said good things, Katherine replied. He said you are stubborn, independent, and do not suffer fools. Kenneth's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. Sounds about right for anyone who would put up with Keith. Pa, Keith said, but there was affection in his exasperation. They sat on Kenneth's porch drinking cold water and making awkward small talk. Katherine could feel the distance between father and son, the careful way they navigated around certain topics. Finally, Kenneth said, Keith tells me you have been helping him learn to open up again, to trust people. I think it has been mutual, Katherine said carefully. Kenneth nodded slowly. My son is a good man, better than I ever was. After his mother died, I got lost in my own grief, pushed him away when he needed me most. He has every right to be angry with me. I am not angry, Pa, Keith said quietly. We both hurt each other. Maybe it is time we forgave ourselves for that. Kenneth's eyes were suddenly bright with unshed tears. I would like that, son. I would like that very much. Katherine watched as father and son stood and embraced, a brief but meaningful gesture. She thought about her own father, about all the things that had been left unsaid between them. He was dead now, beyond the reach of reconciliation, but maybe that was all right. Maybe some wounds did not need to heal. Maybe it was enough to survive them and build something new on the other side. As they rode back to her homestead that evening, Keith said, "Thank you for coming with me today. I know it was not easy." "Family is never easy," Katherine said, "but I am glad you are trying to mend things with your father. He clearly loves you. He does in his way." Keith glanced at her. "Do you ever think about trying to contact anyone from your old life? Friends, maybe, or distant relatives?" Katherine considered the question. "Sometimes. But I think that person I was in Ohio is gone. I am someone different now. And the people who knew me then would not recognize who I have become." "Is that a bad thing?" "No," Katherine said after a moment. "I think it is a good thing. I like who I am now better than who I was then." "I like who you are too," Keith said, and the simple honesty in his voice made Katherine smile. October arrived with crisp air and the promise of winter on the horizon. Katherine and Keith had fallen into a pattern that felt almost like partnership. He helped her prepare her homestead for the cold months ahead, reinforcing the barn, stacking firewood, making sure her stove was in good working order. She helped him with his work on the Holloway Ranch, the large spread where he was employed, riding out to assist with herding cattle or mending fence line. The other ranch hands had given Keith grief at first about bringing a woman along, but Katherine quickly proved herself capable. She could rope and ride with the best of them, and she was not afraid of hard work. She earned their respect, which meant more to her than she expected. "You are good at this," Keith said one day as they rode back from moving cattle to a different pasture. "Ranching, I mean." "Did you grow up around horses?" "My mother's family had a small farm," Katherine said. "Before she married my father and moved to the city. She used to tell me stories about it, and when I was little, we would visit sometimes. I loved it there. The animals, the open space, the way everything had a rhythm and purpose." She looked out over the rolling prairie, golden in the autumn light. "I think part of why I came here was to find that again, that feeling of being connected to something larger than myself." "You found it," Keith observed. "You have built something real here, Katherine, something that matters." "We built it," Katherine corrected. "I could not have done half of it without your help." Keith shook his head. "I just helped with the heavy lifting." "You did all the important parts, the planning, the persistence, the refusal to give up. That was all you." Katherine felt a surge of affection so strong it almost hurt. "Keith Dawson, when did you get so good at saying exactly the right thing?" "I have a good teacher," Keith said with a grin. "You are teaching me how to be patient, how to listen, how to see what people need even when they do not ask for it." "That is a dangerous skill," Katherine said. "Seeing what people need. Maybe, but it is also a gift." Keith reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly. "You are a gift, Katherine Voss. I hope you know that." She did not trust herself to speak, so she just squeezed his hand and let the moment settle around them like the golden light. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in mid-November and temperatures dropping fast. Katherine prepared as best she could, but she had never weathered a Nebraska winter alone before. She was anxious about it. though she tried not to show it. Keith must have sensed her worry because he showed up one Saturday morning with a wagon full of supplies. "Extra firewood," he explained as he began unloading, "and some preserved food from the ranch stores. Mr. Holloway said to give you his regards and to tell you that you are welcome to shelter at the ranch if the weather gets too bad." "I will be fine here," Katherine said automatically, but then she caught herself. "But thank you to both of you. That is kind." Keith paused in his unloading, giving her a look that was equal parts surprise and pleasure. "Did Katherine Voss just accept help without arguing? Should I check you for fever?" "Do not push your luck," Katherine said, but she was smiling. "I am trying to be better about this. About accepting that I do not have to do everything alone." "I noticed," Keith said softly, "and I am proud of you." They spent the day preparing for winter together, working in comfortable silence broken by occasional conversation. By the time evening fell and the temperature dropped further, Keith had helped her secure everything that needed securing. They stood in her barn, checking on the animals one last time, and Katherine was suddenly struck by how natural this felt, how right. "Keith," she said as they walked back toward the house through the first real snowfall of the season, "do you ever think about the future, about what you want your life to look like?" Keith stopped walking, turning to face her. Snow was gathering on his hat and shoulders, and his breath made clouds in the cold air. "I think about it all the time," he said, "especially lately." "What do you think about?" "I think about having my own place someday. Not a big ranch like Holloway's, but something manageable. A few head of cattle, some horses, good land for crops, a home that is really mine." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "And I think about sharing it with someone, with you if you wanted that." Katherine's heart was racing. "That is a big thing to think about. I know. And I know we have only been courting a few months. There is no rush, Katherine, but I want you to know where my thoughts are, where my heart is." He reached out and gently brushed snow from her hair. "I love you. I think I have loved you since the day you were too stubborn to admit you were dying from a gunshot wound." Katherine felt tears mixing with melted snow on her cheeks. "That is a terrible moment to fall in love with someone." "Maybe," Keith said with a slight smile. "But it was the moment I knew you were different from anyone I had ever met. You are strong and brave and so determined to survive on your own terms. I love that about you. I love everything about you." "I love you too," Katherine whispered, and saying it felt like jumping off a cliff, like the most terrifying and exhilarating thing she had ever done. "I have been fighting it because I was scared, but I love you, Keith. I love you so much it terrifies me." Keith pulled her close, and she went willingly, wrapping her arms around him and pressing her face against his chest. "Then we can be terrified together," he said, echoing his words from months ago. "And maybe eventually we will stop being so scared and just be happy." "I want that," Katherine said. "I want to be happy. With you." "Then that is what we will build," Keith said. "Together." He kissed her there in the snow, with winter settling around them and her small homestead glowing with lamplight nearby. Katherine kissed him back and felt something she had not felt in years. Hope for a future that was not just about surviving but about truly living. The winter was hard, as Nebraska winters tended to be, but Katherine found it less lonely than she expected. Keith came by whenever the weather permitted, and on the days when the snow was too deep or the wind too fierce, Katherine found she missed him with an ache that was both painful and sweet. She had spent so long telling herself she did not need anyone that discovering she wanted someone was revelatory. They talked about the future more as winter progressed. Keith was saving money to buy his own land, and Katherine had a small amount set aside as well. "We could combine our resources," Keith suggested one evening as they sat by her stove, playing cards to pass the time. Pool what we have and get a bigger spread than either of us could afford alone. You mean get married, Katherine said, her heart in her throat. Eventually, yes. Keith set down his cards and looked at her seriously. I want to marry you, Katherine. I want to build a life with you, but I know you need time and I am willing to wait as long as you need. Katherine thought about marriage, about what it had meant in her old life. Ownership, obligation, the loss of self. But sitting here with Keith, she realized it did not have to mean those things. It could mean partnership. It could mean choosing each other every day. What if we did it this spring, she heard herself say. Got married, I mean. And used our combined savings to buy land near your father's place. He is getting older and I know he would like you close by. Keith's face lit up with joy and surprise. Are you sure? Katherine, I do not want you to feel rushed. I am sure, Katherine said, and she meant it. I am scared, but I am sure. You have shown me that love does not have to mean losing myself. You have never tried to change me or control me. You have just loved me for exactly who I am, and I want to spend my life with someone like that. With you. Keith stood and pulled her up into his arms, spinning her around her small house until she was laughing and telling him to put her down before they broke something. I am going to make you so happy, he promised, when he finally set her on her feet. I am going to spend every day trying to be worthy of you. You already are, Katherine said, cupping his face in her hands. You saved my life, Keith Dawson, in more ways than one. They married in April 1879, on a warm day when the prairie was covered in wildflowers, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. The ceremony was small, held in the same church where they had danced together that first time. Kenneth Dawson stood as Keith's best man, and Mrs. Chen from the Mercantile stood with Katherine. Doc Henderson and a handful of others from town attended, and if Margaret Shaw was disappointed not to be invited, she kept it to herself. Katherine wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Keith wore his best suit with a wildflower in his buttonhole. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her husband, Katherine said yes without hesitation, her voice clear and strong. Keith's voice was thick with emotion when he said his own vows, and there were tears on his cheeks when he kissed her. They had used their combined savings to buy 200 acres adjacent to Kenneth's ranch. The land had a small house that needed work and good grazing for cattle. It was not much yet, but it was theirs, and they both saw its potential. Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson, Keith said as he carried her over the threshold of their new house. Katherine Voss Dawson, Katherine corrected with a smile. I am keeping my name too. Katherine Voss Dawson, Keith repeated, setting her down carefully. I like the sound of that. They spent their wedding night in their new home, and for the first time in her life, Katherine understood what it meant to be truly intimate with someone. Not just physically, though that was part of it, but emotionally. To let someone see all of her, the broken parts and the strong parts, the scared parts and the brave parts, and to be loved anyway. It was terrifying and wonderful and exactly right. The first year of marriage was not without its challenges. They learned each other's rhythms, their habits, the ways they handled stress and conflict. Katherine still struggled sometimes with asking for help, and Keith sometimes tried too hard to fix things that were not broken. But they talked through their issues, and they never went to bed angry, and slowly they built something solid and real. Katherine sold her old homestead and used the money to buy cattle. Keith took on extra work to supplement their income while they built up their herd. They worked from dawn until dusk, and they fell into bed exhausted most nights, but there was joy in the work, in building something together. Kenneth Dawson became a regular presence in their lives. He helped with the heavy work, and in return, Keith and Katherine made sure he had company and good meals. Katherine watched as father and son rebuilt their relationship, and she was glad to be part of that healing. In the fall of 1880, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a mix of joy and terror. She had never thought much about children, had never imagined herself as a mother, but Keith was ecstatic and his joy was infectious. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Katherine, we are going to be parents." "I am afraid I will not be good at it," Katherine admitted one night as they lay in bed, Keith's hand resting on her still flat stomach. "What if I mess this up? What if I am too hard or too distant, or I do not know how to love them the way they need?" "You will be wonderful," Keith said with absolute certainty. "You are strong and kind and brave. Our child will be lucky to have you as a mother." "But what if—" "No what ifs," Keith interrupted gently. "We will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." "You do not have to do this alone, Katherine. You will never have to do anything alone again." The pregnancy was difficult. Katherine worked as long as she could, refusing to let a baby slow her down, but eventually even her stubbornness had to give way to physical limitations. Keith took on more of the work, and Kenneth helped where he could. Doc Henderson checked on her regularly, and despite his grumbling about stubborn women who did not know when to rest, he assured them that both Katherine and the baby were healthy. Their son was born in May 1881, after a long and difficult labor that left Katherine exhausted but triumphant. They named him Henry James Dawson, and he was perfect, small and wrinkled and loud, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination. "Look at him," Keith said, holding his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "Katherine, look at what we made." Katherine, tired and sore but filled with a fierce love she had never imagined possible, smiled. "He is beautiful." "He is perfect," Keith corrected. "Just like his mother." Motherhood transformed Katherine in ways she did not expect. She had thought she might struggle with the vulnerability of caring for someone so completely, but instead, she found that loving Henry came naturally. She was fiercely protective of him, but she also learned to accept help from Keith and Kenneth. She learned that letting people support her did not make her weak. It made her human. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, Katherine marveled at his personality. He was curious and adventurous, always getting into things he should not, always asking questions. He looked like Keith but had Katherine's stubborn streak, which made both his parents laugh. "I was like this as a child." Katherine asked Keith one afternoon as they watched 3-year-old Henry try to catch a chicken. "According to you, you were worse," Keith said with a grin. "Remember, you told me you once climbed onto your roof to see what was up there." "I was 6 and curious," Katherine defended herself, but she was smiling. "At least Henry has 2 parents who are paying attention." "And a grandfather who spoils him rotten," Keith added, nodding toward where Kenneth was showing Henry how to whistle. Their ranch grew steadily. By 1884, they had a respectable herd of cattle and were turning a modest profit. They built an addition onto their house to give Henry his own room and to prepare for the possibility of more children. Katherine had lost a pregnancy in 1883, which had devastated both of them. But Doc Henderson assured them it was not uncommon, and they could try again when they were ready. Katherine found she liked being part of a community in a way she never had before. She was no longer the strange woman who lived alone, but rather Katherine Dawson, wife of Keith, mother of Henry, neighbor and friend to many. She served on the church committee to help new homesteaders, and she was known for her willingness to help women who were struggling, especially those trying to make it on their own. She understood their fear, their pride, their desperate need to prove they could survive. "You have changed," Keith observed one night as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Henry was asleep inside, and the prairie stretched out before them in shades of gold and purple. "Have I?" Katherine leaned against his shoulder. "When I first met you, you would not let anyone within 10 feet of your walls. Now you are out there helping every person who needs it." "I learned from the best," Katherine said. "A certain stubborn cowboy who would not take no for an answer when I was bleeding to death." "That cowboy was pretty smart," Keith said. "He was," Katherine agreed. "He taught me that letting people help you is not weakness, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone." "I am glad you trusted me," Keith said quietly. "I am glad you let me in." "So am I." In the spring of 1885, Katherine became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in December she gave birth to twin girls. They named them Emma Rose and Sarah Grace, and they were as different as night and day. Emma was quiet and thoughtful, while Sarah was loud and demanding. Henry, now 4, took his role as big brother very seriously, always trying to help take care of his sisters. Life on the ranch was busy and chaotic with 3 young children, but Katherine would not have changed it for anything. This life, this family, was something she had built with her own hands and heart. It was messy and imperfect and exactly right. Keith Dawson died peacefully in his sleep in 1887. They found him in his bed one morning, looking like he had simply decided not to wake up. Keith grieved deeply but without bitterness. "We made our peace," he told Katherine as they stood by his father's grave. "I am grateful for that. I am grateful we had those years to rebuild what we had broken." They inherited Kenneth's ranch, which they merged with their own. The additional land and resources allowed them to expand their operation significantly. Keith hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and Katherine took over managing the books and business side of things. She discovered she had a knack for numbers and negotiation, and under her management, the ranch began to thrive. The years passed in a blur of seasons. Henry grew tall and strong, learning ranching from his father and business sense from his mother. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together. In 1891, Katherine gave birth to another son whom they named Thomas Michael. He was a surprise, as they had thought they were done having children, but he was a welcome one. 4 children, Keith said one night as they watched their family around the dinner table. Henry was 15 now, the twins were 6, and Thomas was barely walking. "When did we become a family of 6? "When you refused to let me die in the street," Katherine said. "That is when this all started." Keith reached across the table and took her hand. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Katherine said, squeezing his fingers. "Trusting you, letting you in. It was the scariest thing I ever did, but also the best." As their children grew, Keith and Katherine made sure to teach them the values that had built their family. Hard work, yes, but also compassion. Independence, yes, but also the wisdom to accept help when needed. They taught Henry and the girls and little Thomas that being strong did not mean doing everything alone. It meant knowing when to stand on your own and when to lean on the people who loved you. Henry eventually took over much of the ranch operation, with his parents serving more as advisors than active workers. He married a schoolteacher named Laura Simmons in 1895, and they built a house on the far edge of the ranch property. Emma married a young rancher from a neighboring spread in 1900, while Sarah shocked everyone by deciding to go to teachers' college in Lincoln. Thomas, it became clear early on, had a gift with horses and wanted to become a horse trainer. Katherine and Keith were grandparents by 1897, when Henry and Laura had their first child, a daughter they named Katherine after her grandmother. Holding that baby, seeing her son as a father, Katherine was overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had built. She thought about the woman she had been in 1878, bleeding and alone and convinced she needed no one. That woman would not recognize who Katherine had become. "What are you thinking about?" Keith asked one evening in 1903. They were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset as they had done countless times over the years. They were both in their late 40s now, with silver starting to thread through their hair, but they still held hands like young lovers. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Katherine said. "How lucky we are to have found each other, to have built all this." She gestured at the ranch, at the house where their children had grown up, at the prairie that had become home. "I am the lucky one," Keith said. "You taught me that persistence and love can overcome anything, even the most stubborn woman in Nebraska." "I was not that stubborn," Katherine protested, but she was laughing. "You would not ask for help if you were dying," Keith reminded her. "Literally. That is how we met." "And you helped me anyway," Katherine said softly. "You saw someone who needed help, and you gave it without asking for anything in return. You saved my life, and then you taught me how to live it." "We taught each other," Keith said. "You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, that some people are worth believing in, even when they do not believe in themselves." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, they could hear their grandchildren playing in the yard. "I love you," Katherine said. "I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for 25 more." "I love you too," Keith replied. "You are my heart, Katherine Voss Dawson. Always have been, always will be." As darkness fell over the Nebraska prairie, Katherine thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened woman running from her past to a wife, mother, grandmother, and successful rancher. From someone who could not accept help to someone who freely gave it. From surviving to thriving. She had been shot and left for dead once, had been too proud and scared to ask for help. But Keith Dawson had helped her anyway. He had carried her when she could not walk, defended her when she could not fight, and loved her when she could not love herself. He had won her trust, and in doing so, he had won her heart. They had built a life together out of hard work, patience, and stubborn love. They had raised children who were strong and kind. They had created a legacy that would outlast them both. And through it all, they had each other. As the stars came out one by one over the prairie, Katherine leaned her head on Keith's shoulder and smiled. She was home. Not just in this place, but in this life with this man. She was finally, completely, perfectly home. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. In 1905, Sarah returned from Lincoln with her teaching certificate and a husband she had met at college, a lawyer named David Richardson. They settled in Red Cloud, and Sarah became one of the most beloved teachers in the county. Thomas did indeed become a renowned horse trainer, and people came from across Nebraska to buy horses he had worked with. Katherine and Keith gradually stepped back from active ranching, letting Henry take the lead while they enjoyed their role as grandparents. They had 7 grandchildren by 1910, with more on the way, and their house was always full of noise and laughter. Katherine, who had once lived in solitude, now could not imagine a life without this chaos, this abundance of family. "Remember when it was just the two of us?" Keith asked one Sunday afternoon when the entire family had gathered for dinner. There were children running everywhere, adults talking over each other, and someone had spilled milk on the floor for the 3rd time. "Barely," Katherine said with a laugh. "Was it really that quiet?" "It was peaceful," Keith said. "But this is better." "This is definitely better," Katherine agreed, watching Henry swing his youngest daughter up onto his shoulders while Emma helped the twins set the table. "I would not trade this for anything." As they grew older, Keith and Katherine became the heart of their family and community. They were known for their generosity, their wisdom, and their enduring love for each other. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Katherine always told them the same thing. Learn to accept help, even when your pride tells you not to. Learn to trust someone enough to let them see you at your weakest. That is where real love lives. In 1918, on their 39th wedding anniversary, Keith and Katherine hosted a celebration at the ranch. All 4 of their children were there, along with their spouses and children. There were 14 grandchildren now, ranging from toddlers to young adults. The house they had built together was filled with music and laughter and love. "How did we get so lucky?" Keith asked as they danced slowly in their living room surrounded by family. "We were not lucky," Katherine said. "We worked for this. We fought for it. We chose each other every single day, even on the hard days." "Especially on the hard days," Keith agreed. He pulled her closer, and even after all these years, Katherine still felt her heart skip when he held her. "I would do it all again, you know. Every moment, every struggle, every triumph. All of it, just to end up here with you." "So would I," Katherine whispered. 1,000 times over. They danced until the stars came out, watched by their children and grandchildren, a testament to what could be built when 2 broken people chose to heal together. When someone who would not ask for help learned to trust the person who helped anyway. When stubbornness met patience, and fear met faith, and 2 hearts decided they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. As the celebration wound down and family members began to head home or to their own houses on the ranch property, Katherine and Keith stood on their porch one last time. The prairie stretched out before them, exactly as it had 40 years ago when Keith first helped a bleeding, stubborn woman who refused to admit she needed saving. "I am glad you did not listen to me that day," Katherine said, "when I told you to leave me alone." "I am glad too," Keith said. "Because loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Better than taming wild horses. Better than anything," Keith said firmly. "You are my greatest adventure, Katherine Voss Dawson. You always have been." They stood together in the darkness. 2 people who had built a life from scratch, who had turned pain into purpose and fear into love. The woman who would not ask for help had learned that accepting it was a strength, not a weakness. The cowboy who could not save his mother had found redemption in saving someone else. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, something that would ripple out through generations. As they finally turned to go inside, Katherine took one last look at the prairie, at the land they had worked and loved, at the home they had built. She thought about that day in July 1878 when she had been shot and bleeding, determined to handle everything herself. She thought about Keith riding up on his bay horse, refusing to let her die alone in the street. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Keith asked, pausing at the door. "For not giving up on me, for helping me when I would not ask, for loving me even when I did not know how to love you back." Keith smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had not changed in 4 decades. "Always, Katherine, always and forever." They went inside together, closing the door on the Nebraska night. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and the stars shone down on a ranch built by love and stubbornness, and 2 people who proved that sometimes the best things in life are the things we did not know we needed. Sometimes the greatest gift is someone who refuses to let you face the world alone, even when everything in you says you must. Katherine Voss Dawson had learned to trust. Keith Dawson had won that trust through patience and unwavering devotion. Together, they had built not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And that, Katherine thought as she fell asleep in Keith's arms that night, was worth more than all the independence in the world.